I am not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I am afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion. Alexander the Great. There is no other figure like Alexander the Great who so profoundly affected both the ancient and the new world, who created such radical changes, accomplished feats that far surpassed the limits of reality, imagination, and miracle, yet whose personality was equally controversial, filled with enigma and contradictions. Even after nearly 2.5 millennia, modern historiography still struggles to comprehend and explain the achievements of this young genius who fundamentally altered the formation and course of the ancient and modern worlds, who both united and extremely polarized the East and the West, bringing them to their present state, and at times finds itself helpless. The stream of technical research with historical, geographical, and cultural content, and the books describing his exciting, tumultuous life, including his physical and spiritual aspects, never ceases. Of course, we are referring to countries outside of Turkey. Although the source material is the same, in the Western world, anyone who delves into history has undoubtedly written a book or conducted extensive research about him. This is because his personality and his actions create approaches and multifaceted dimensions that do not fit into ordinary molds and clichés for the historian. Consequently, anyone who wishes to be a master in the field of universal historiography feels empowered to express an opinion about him. However, despite being the ruler of Anatolian lands, no one in Turkey who calls themselves a historian has ever seriously pondered him, taken an interest in him, or written about him. Among his legacies, the most beloved and popular in Turkey are without a doubt the gold coins that constantly adorn the dreams of treasure hunters and collectors. In Roman historiography, his accomplishments inspired immense admiration, especially considering the Greek cities, which, until the time of his father and himself, were thousands of city-states trapped within narrow borders, far from any universal vision or unitary state structure, constantly bickering amongst themselves, completely alien to central authority, and to which he was only just beginning to assert his sovereignty. But, surprisingly, the Romans did not show the necessary interest in this new star rising just across the Adriatic Sea. Very few Roman historians questioned why Alexander did not pay attention to Rome, nor did they speculate whether had he lived longer, he might one day have crossed the Alps and attacked the Italian peninsula, just like Hannibal. Truly, this child genius was better suited to Italy than to Asia. For starters, he could have established in a single year the unity of Italy that hundreds of kings and consuls failed to achieve in 500 years, and finished the job. Let's be honest and immediately issue a warning. When the many fabricated actions, words, successes, myths, and other legends attributed to him are stripped away, what remains is still enough to leave one speechless. And frankly, it makes you think that only a Hercules could have overcome such challenges.
It is not for nothing that great men like Julius Caesar, George Washington, and Napoleon Bonaparte studied his life carefully. His influence is hidden in the achievements and actions of each one of them. The system he established was entirely different from the swift and temporary occupations known in classical history as lightning empires. Yes, the armies of the Goths, Huns, Scythians, Tamerlane, Genghis Khan, the Ottomans, Napoleon, and Hitler also occupied vast territories with lightning speed. But they never achieved what Alexander accomplished. We are talking about cultural superiority and the mark he left, his sphere of influence. Yes, let's admit, many were barbarians, but unlike the Mongol invaders, he set out by grounding himself in Greek cultural values, which his own Macedonian race lacked, and by championing the mission of these superior values. Otherwise, his dominance in lands conquered by the sword alone could not have been permanent. Examples show that rebellion flags were raised before the spilled blood had even dried. Of course, he did not and could not establish the indispensable cultural and urbanistic institutions of the Greek way of life, such as theaters, gymnasiums, stadiums, and agoras in the cities he occupied, because he had no time. He contented himself with merely placing military garrisons. But in the traces he left in the places he passed through and captured, there were hidden, enchanting, magical and impressive things not seen anywhere else. If desired, historiography can certainly provide an explanation for this enigma. Let us repeat. The situation was hidden within the mission, which at that time did not yet bear the stamp of Hellenism. If we ask and consider, did the missionary St. Paul and his companion Barnabas have armies that they managed to conquer so many hearts in such a short time? We can explain the situation more easily. In addition, there is another very important point. His goal and mission also included liberating the peoples living in the lands he visited from Persian despotism and restoring their freedom. In history, radical changes like occupation, dethronement, assassination, and usurpation have always been carried out under the pretext of freeing the masses from oppression and captivity, from despotism, in short, of bringing them freedom. We see with countless examples in today's world how false, fabricated, and deceptive this is. The saying, "The mouse's tear is the cat's joy," fits perfectly here. In historiography, speculation is permissible. Let us make one, albeit on a small scale, in this context. The question of whether the Mongols, who left nothing but ruins, corpses, and heaps of skulls in their wake, and who lacked any cultural value to offer in most of the places they occupied, would have been more effective and successful if they had come, for example, with a Buddhist Chinese identity, is not a mere historical speculation. It is a question worth pondering deeply. Let us not forget that cultural interaction and communication are like connected vessels. The higher side always gives. The absence of a contemporary historian who witnessed the events and wrote the complete life story of that unique great man is a great loss and deficiency. And many of the reasons behind his being shrouded in clouds of legend are hidden here. Would the Greeks, who exaggerated historical narrative to the extreme, ever hold back upon seeing such a genius? Of course, there were those who wrote and described him in every aspect, but their works have unfortunately been lost. Among them are Ptolemy and Aristobulus, whom the famous biographer Arrian used as his main sources. When the lack of a biography is added to his superhuman feats, which are impossible to fit into one lifetime, the human imagination, already not fond of real history, this time fabricated long stories called the Alexander Romance. This new literary genre, which entered medieval Persian and Arabic literature as the Iskandername, became far more popular than his real life, again due to the common weakness of people. They describe him as a devout, charitable, kind-hearted, and compassionate Christian king. Although not certain, some researchers claim that Dul-Qarnayn, mentioned in the Quran, which is not very aligned with actual history, and meaning the two-horned one, refers to Alexander. In an environment overflowing with unknowns and fanaticism, speculations naturally arise, and one of the latest is that he was a psychopath. As we will discuss his family life below, this view should not be dismissed, especially in light of the traumas he endured.
While Anatolia was a homeland for the Hittites, Romans, Byzantines, and Turks, for Alexander it was a bridge. No one in history has left as lasting and deep a mark on Anatolia as Alexander. Of course, his ultimate target was not Anatolia. Anatolia was a passage that led him to the historic mission of vengeance he was given. The aim was to liberate the western Anatolian cities groaning under Persian pressure, militarily, economically, and politically. But the real target was Susa and Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire, the eternal enemy of the Greeks. Had not Xerxes had the audacity to enter the lands of Greece, he had to pay the price. He had to be punished. Alexander was a born warrior, a strategist, a person full of extraordinary ambitions. He fought on the front lines in all battles and set an example for his soldiers. He had a personality that managed to balance compassion with severity and love with ambition within himself. He was born in 356 before Christ and died in Babylon at the other end of his empire in 323 before Christ at only 33 years of age. In a short period of about 11 years, he conquered Greece in the eastern Mediterranean world, Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kashmir, and parts of India. He conquered the known world of his time. His real intention was to reach the end of the world and the distant outer sea, of which the Greek geographers of the time had a flawed conception. In world history, there is no precedent for such a rapidly developing empire. The paths he followed, thousands of kilometers from his main base in Macedonia, and the principles by which he chose them, are also full of mystery. Apart from the main stages, it is not possible to determine the exact routes he took. Many people have tried to follow this route on horseback and in their jeeps, but they have not been successful. The paths he traveled are at least as enigmatic as the places Hannibal passed through while crossing the Alps. At first glance, an achievement that is not immediately obvious is his service to the natural sciences. 2,500 years ago, the scientists he took with his army made discoveries on a wide variety of subjects. They fed his teacher, Aristotle, a man so passionate for knowledge that he would say, "If there is one thing I know, it is that I know nothing," who remained behind the front with information they compiled from the exotic lands they visited regarding zoology, fauna, rivers, and geology. His most valuable work is Hellenism, the synthesis of Eastern and Hellenic values that marked the subsequent 300 years after his death and became the main foundation for the birth of modern Europe. Alexander was a man of Macedonian descent who later became Hellenized. He was born in the capital, Pella, as the son of King Philip of Macedon and Princess Olympias. The nickname Alexandros Megas, meaning Alexander the Great, was given to him by ancient writers. As with the life of every great man, writers have invented many legends about his birth. According to Plutarch, Olympias dreamed on the night she conceived him that a lightning bolt struck her womb, and flames spread in all directions. In another dream, Philip saw himself stamping his wife's womb with a seal bearing the image of a lion. The last dream was interpreted as Olympias being pregnant with him before they were married, or as would become very common later, and even include Jesus, that his father was Zeus.
The legends never end. According to another legend, the temple of Artemis in Ephesus burned down because the goddess Artemis who resided there had left her temple to witness Alexander's birth. There is also a story told about his horse, Bucephalus, which he always rode and which took him all the way to India. His father had bought the horse from merchants, but it was so wild that no one could ride it. Alexander, watching from a distance, noticed that the horse was restless because it was frightened by its own shadow.
He approached and mounted the horse without showing it its shadow. Philip was very moved, and with tears streaming down his face, he kissed his son. He said, "My son, Macedonia will be too small for you. It is best that you go and conquer great lands." It is believed that his own efforts to display his superhuman character were also hidden in the creation of all these fabrications. His birthplace is the capital, Pella. As we said, it is in Greek Macedonia, which remains under Greek occupation. He received lessons from many people at a young age and was carefully educated. As a child, he was taught by Lanike, the daughter of one of his future generals, Clytus, and by Leonidas, a relative of his mother. Among the things he learned, playing the lyre, riding, fighting, and hunting held important places. He expressed the value of his education with these words, "I owe my life to my father, but I owe my good life to my teacher." The words attributed to him, "I would rather learn the most valuable secrets of philosophy than the art of war," are proof that he received a good education. When he was just 11, his father sent him to be educated by the sage and thinker of the age, Aristotle. His education continued until he was 16. It was the education he received from him that made this energetic, unruly boy a Greek. The art of rhetoric, literature, geography, the science of war, natural sciences, medicine, and philosophy were among the subjects he learned at a young age. Without these, there could be no Alexander. He was already learning the art of war, sports, and horsemanship at the palace. Thus, he was preparing to become the master of the ancient world. As we mentioned earlier, among the reasons that made him an extraordinary man, both positively and negatively, were the contradictory special circumstances of his family life. Since his father, as a king and soldier, was constantly on campaigns, he was deprived of the necessary fatherly affection. The bonds of love between father and son were non-existent, also due to constant separation. His mother, filled with excessive ambitions, could not, of course, replace his father, and she also intensely hated her husband, unable to accept that he was married to other women besides her and had stepchildren. One of them, Cleopatra, was killed by Olympias herself the year after the king's death. The quarrel between father and son reached its peak during the wedding ceremony with Cleopatra, and the father even sent his insolent son who interfered in his affairs into exile. The event that led to the exile was as follows. While everyone was drunk from the generously poured wine, Cleopatra's uncle, Attalus, stood up and said, "Macedonians, you should pray to the gods to grant you a legitimate and suitable prince from this new marriage." Upon hearing this, Alexander went mad and threw the goblet in his hand at his head, shouting, "You scoundrel! Am I a bastard son?" Philip, taking his wife's uncle's side, jumped to his feet, and just as he was about to attack his son, either the wine he had drunk too much of or his haste caused him to slip and fall to the ground. Alexander laughed heartily at this and mocked, "Look at this state of affairs. This man preparing to leave Europe and invade Asia cannot even move from one couch to another." But he was exiled for it. He left, taking his mother with him. But not 6 months passed before his father, Philip, unable to give up his son, allowed him to return. Olympias, who struggled to share her husband with 7 other harem women, of course wanted to see only her own son as king on the throne of Macedonia. To prevent Philip's son from another wife, Aridaeus, from ascending the throne, she had him poisoned, and the child lost his intellect. In 336 before Christ, Philip attended a wedding ceremony in Aegae. His daughter, Cleopatra, was getting married. Here he was assassinated by the head of his guard. The great King Philip was dead. There were many preparations concerning who would be king, and all sorts of rumors were circulating. In the end, fortune smiled upon Alexander. The Macedonian state that Alexander inherited had a structure built on solid foundations. Philip had developed his country's rich gold resources and had established the League of Corinth by subduing and making agreements with the Greek city-states. This was a great step for the freedom-loving Greeks who knew no unity. As is common in all times and places, the Thracian tribes, especially the Trebalians, Celts, and Marcomanni, seized the opportunity of the change in throne and rebelled. Alexander suppressed them by campaigning until he reached the Danube River and the Illyrian coasts. He destroyed the city of Thebes, which did not recognize Macedonian hegemony and had started a rebellion by spreading rumors that Alexander had died in Illyrian lands and enslaved its inhabitants. Then he marched on Athens and Thessaly. On the way, he stopped at the city of Thermopylae, where the battle against the Persians had once been fought. In this historic place, he was elected leader of the Greek city-states. He continued on to Corinth. It was here that he met the philosopher Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes was lying half-naked in the middle of the street, living in a barrel. According to legend, Alexander had heard of Diogenes and asked him, "Is there anything you want from me?" When he made it clear that he pitied his miserable state, Diogenes uttered his famous words, "Stand out of my light, I ask for no other favor." It is said that Alexander was very pleased with both this strange man and his words, and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would very much like to be Diogenes." The League of Corinth elected the young Alexander as their commander-in-chief. His father already held such authority, but his life was not long enough for the campaign. Now the time had finally come to organize the pan-Hellenic revenge campaign against the barbarian Persians who had made the Greeks suffer for centuries, especially in the Ionian cities. In the early spring of 336 before Christ, after leaving the administration of his homeland Macedonia to Antipater, Alexander took his army of between 35,000 and 48,000 soldiers and set off towards Thrace. He soon reached the Dardanelles Strait. The mysterious lands of Asia, which would swallow him forever, were now within arm's reach, right across from him. How would he cross the swift and windy waters? Would he, like Xerxes, who knew nothing of navies and was angry at the raging waters, whip the seas? The soldiers embarked on ships on the Gallipoli Peninsula and were ferried across to Abydos, which is near modern-day Çanakkale. How true it is, we do not know. Legend has it that Alexander, a man of the land with no known training in seamanship, personally steered the admiral's ship, which would be a fabrication. When the ships reached the middle of the strait, a bull was sacrificed to Poseidon and the sea goddesses. Libations were poured from a golden goblet. As he approached the shore, Alexander, to emphasize that he had come to make war, not diplomacy like his father, threw his spear into the Asian soil. He was the first to set foot on the Asian continent armed from head to toe. Who knows what he felt in these mysterious lands full of legends? In fact, in 336 before Christ, he had sent an army of 10,000 men under the command of Parmenion, Amyntas, and Attalus to Asia, and had begun preliminary preparations for the invasion. However, upon news of Parmenion's death, the Ionian cities rebelled, and this unit was defeated at Magnesia by the Persian mercenary commander Memnon.
In a deep, resonant voice, Alexander had monuments erected for Zeus, Athena, and Heracles where he first set foot. He strived to gain their blessing and favor. His first stop was Troy, where the legendary war was fought, because, like everyone who knew Greek, the Homeric epics had also brainwashed him. He offered all the armor he wore as a votive offering to the city's patron goddess, Athena. But in return, he took plenty of the historic weapons that had been preserved there since the Trojan War. The weapons he took from Troy were carried by his guards in the front ranks in his future battles as sacred and talismanic objects, believed to bring good luck and victory. He set out from Troy and came to Oribe and set up camp. The next day he set off and came to Percote and Lampsacus. He passed through the foothills of Mount Ida and proceeded south. He continuously sent out reconnaissance parties, monitoring the movements of the Persian army and navy. The commander-in-chief of the Persian army was Arsames, and he was accompanied by the satrap of Lydia and Ionia, Spithridates, and the satrap of Phrygia, Arsaces. The camp of the combined army of Persian and Greek mercenaries was established near Gonen. Presumably, with Darius's influence, the Persians did not take Alexander very seriously as a potential threat. Memnon, who worked in the Persian service, was pursuing a scorched earth policy, ordering the burning and destruction of the places Alexander would pass through. This way, the enemy would be deprived of supplies. However, the satraps rejected this. The Persian commanders, hearing of the approaching Macedonian soldiers, began to debate whether to engage in battle immediately. Alexander, however, had already approached the Biga River. When one looks at Alexander's battles collectively, it is seen that most of them took place on rivers. He considered rivers a strategic advantage, thus not only preventing the enemy's rapid advance, but also preventing the numerically superior Persian war chariots from gaining effectiveness and superiority in terrain filled with ditches and swamps. The Persians were positioned just on the other side of the river, but quite high up. Parmenion was warning of the dangers of immediately crossing the deep, steep-banked river, which was evidently flowing with a lot of water at the time. Alexander at that moment said, "Will the heroic Macedonian army, which crossed the great strait, be afraid to cross this meager stream? Why do you hesitate?" Despite this, due to strategic considerations, both armies waited silently and motionlessly on the banks of the river for some time. Then a moment came when Alexander suddenly ordered his soldiers to cross the river immediately. Who knows what was on his mind? The tactic was as follows. The soldiers who jumped into the water would let themselves be carried by the river's current. They would not emerge from the river in a mass. The landing area would be as wide as possible, and thus the enemy would be prevented from attacking one point and annihilating those who emerged on the spot. Despite the Persians' intense resistance, the Macedonians who crossed the river made first contact with the enemy and engaged in battle. The number of Persian soldiers was small. The battle between the cavalry units became increasingly fierce. Legends narrate that Alexander's spear broke and he fought with a broken spear for a while. Demaratus of Corinth gave him his own spear, and he continued to fight with it. As soon as he took the new spear in his hand, his first target was the enemy commander, Mithridates, who was standing opposite, and he threw it right at his face, knocking him to the ground. Although one of the Persian commanders charged at Alexander, he managed to bring him down as well. In the end, the leading Persian commanders, satraps, and a large number of soldiers were killed, and this first critical confrontation ended with the rout of the Persians. The Ionian cities, which had been living under Persian rule since the Ionian Revolt of 480 before Christ, had finally regained their freedom, and the first step of the revenge that had been building in the hearts of the Greeks for years was complete. The main reckoning, that is, the effort to wipe the enemy off the face of the earth, would continue later.
He had the fallen Persian commanders and Greek mercenary soldiers buried with care alongside his own soldiers. He put the prisoners he took in chains and sent them to Macedonia.
Their lives from then on would be spent in labor camps. He appointed Callas as the new satrap in place of satrap Arsaces. The local people would henceforth pay the same tribute to the Macedonians as they had paid to Darius. Parmenion, meanwhile, penetrated deeper into Anatolia and occupied one of the important Persian centers, Daskylium. Summer had now fully arrived, and the heat had set in. These months, also known as the harvest season, are the time when the bloodiest battles are fought. Apart from the heat and dust, there is nothing to hinder the movement of the masses. Now the fronts and directions of advance would be changed. The victorious King Alexander turned south from here to liberate the Ionian cities that the Persians had enslaved nearly 2 centuries earlier. He marched towards the ancient Lydian capital of Sardis, which had been destroyed during those fateful wars. The commander of the Persian fortress, Mithranes, and the people of the city, hearing of Alexander's approach, agreed to surrender. Alexander crossed the Bozda mountains, descended into the Kuchik Menderes valley, and reached Ephesus 4 days later. He was a liberator. Just as the Persian king was a villain, a bloodsucker, a despot, a slaver, a tyrant, Alexander was equally soft-hearted and a champion of freedom. Even if he were not, in the end, those who write history will praise the victors, not the vanquished. When he arrived in Ephesus, he ordered that the tax paid to the Persians should henceforth be donated to the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. Delegates from Magnesia, near Soke, and Tralles in Aidin, located in the inner parts of the Buke-Menderes River, brought news that both cities would surrender without a fight. Now, after the naval battles fought around the island of Lade, near the Menderes River, and at the foothills of Mount Mycale, the leaders of Miletus announced that they would open the city gates to Alexander. But due to the resistance of the occupying Persian forces, Alexander had to besiege the city and take it by tearing down its walls. The Macedonian fleet, anchored at Lade, was instrumental and helpful in Alexander's capture of the city. However, the Macedonian fleet was not of a size or strength to compete with the Persians. Furthermore, the increasingly rugged terrain made coordination between the fleet and the land army difficult. Besides, many Persian cities on the Aegean coast had already been conquered, and from now on it was easy to go to the remaining ones by land. For this reason, Alexander saw the fleet as an unnecessary expense and disbanded it. Alexander heard that a significant number of Persian soldiers had gathered in Halicarnassus, which is modern-day Bodrum. The Persian fleet was also positioned there. All this indicated that the Persians would attack from that direction. He had to suppress the danger before their preparations advanced further. On his way to the city, he occupied the forts and cities on his route and set up camp near the city to besiege Halicarnassus, that is, Bodrum. The fortress of Bodrum was so immense and solidly built that it could not be easily destroyed and occupied. Alexander thought it would be easier to attack the fortress from that direction if he first occupied Gumusluk. He called for surrender. The people of the city, for some reason, informed him that they would surrender the city if he came at night. When Alexander arrived in front of the city at midnight, he found the gates closed. He had also left his siege engines behind. He could be facing a trap. So what would he do now? The only thing to do was to attack without waiting for the trap. The Macedonian soldiers were attacking the walls of Bodrum when Persian troops launched an attack from ships hidden in the darkness. Alexander's army had to regroup and determine their tactics, forcing them to retreat. The Macedonians filled the ditches surrounding the walls of Bodrum with earth. He intensified this work, especially in the areas near the towers, and piled up earth in such a way that the height of the fortresses would be reduced.
His intention was to first capture the towers and from there bombard the inside of the city with catapults and mangonels. The Persian soldiers, seeing that the Macedonians had captured the towers, decided to burn these towers along with the equipment inside them. However, their attempt was repulsed by the Macedonian army. The Persians, unable to withstand the long and difficult siege, now fled to the inner citadel and the heights above Salmacis Bay, and Alexander's soldiers entered the emptied city and took control of Bodrum. This strategic base in the southwest of Anatolia had been captured. Now Alexander could advance further east into the interior with ease.
In the western Aegean, the military occupation was over, and it was now time for administrative arrangements. Alexander left 3,000 mercenary infantry and 200 cavalry as an occupation force in Caria under the command of Ptolemy. He appointed Ada, the daughter of Hecatomnus, as the satrap of Caria. According to Carian traditions, in these lands where sibling marriage was the rule, this woman held power as queen, but the Persian invader Piclodaros had forcibly taken her position. When Alexander came to Caria, Ada had welcomed him very well, even adopting him as her son, and now her old position was restored to her by Alexander. Alexander sent Parmenion to Sardis and the Thessalian troops to the coasts of Lycia and Pamphylia. They were to carry out the necessary reconnaissance and preliminary preparations for the invasion. He himself went to Gojek in the Gulf of Fethiye. From here he proceeded to Lycia and took Telmessos without a fight. Xanthus, which is modern Kinnick, and Patara, a coastal city in Antalya, surrendered along with 30 small forts. Meanwhile, winter had arrived. He attacked the Milyas lands, which extended to Mount Cadmus in the Phrygian territory. News came that the city would surrender without a fight. The news was good, but some sinister plots were also being hatched. Just as he was taking possession of the city, he learned that a rebel named Alexander, the son of Eropus, was preparing a betrayal. This man was one of the assassins who had a hand in the murder of his father, Philip. However, he had helped Alexander when he ascended the throne, and their relationship was not too bad. Meanwhile, the Persians, hearing what was happening and discovering their enemy's enemy, informed the other Alexander that they would provide all possible help in his assassination attempt. The Persians had made this promise: if the rebel Alexander killed Alexander the Great, he would become the king of Macedonia and would also receive 1,000 talents of gold. However, when the Persian envoy was captured by Alexander's men, he confessed the plans. Later, the rebel Alexander was captured and executed. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to take down the cities in Anatolia one by one. Soon, delegates from Aspendos came and brought the news that they would voluntarily surrender their cities. It seemed that Alexander the Great's luck was holding. The city of Side was also among the cities that surrendered. From here, Alexander went to the Silion fortress, that is the Yan Köy Hisari. The fortress was not in a state to be easily taken. Besides the mercenaries inside, the local people who were too proud of their freedom to surrender to a novice Macedonian were also positioned there. In this situation, it was impossible for him to take the fortress. Alexander had to give up the occupation. Meanwhile, the king learned from the rear that the people of Aspendos had not kept their word and had closed the castle gate to the Macedonians. He turned back and marched on Aspendos. The city was deserted as the people had fled to the mountainous regions of Aspendos. Alexander set up his headquarters in the empty houses. The repentant people begged to be allowed to return. Alexander was angry and intended to punish the city. However, he told the people that he would accept their requests on the condition that they gave their leaders as hostages, and they accepted. He then returned to Perge, and from there set off again to the north, into the interior of Phrygia. He had come to the mountain city of Termessos, built in the wild nature at the foot of the Guluk mountain,
when he witnessed that the fierce local people of this place had occupied both hills. The local people living in this rugged part of the Taurus Mountains were freedom-loving and warlike. The climate and natural conditions also supported them and did not allow invaders from outside. This local people were among the most ferocious, wildest, and most freedom-loving tribes of all ages.
In a deep, resonant voice, Alexander ordered his soldiers to set up camp where they were without wasting time. According to his predictions, the local people, seeing this, would leave the hills and descend to the cities. Indeed, what he said came true, and the hills were evacuated. He attacked the lookouts left behind. Then he crossed the pass without wasting time, and this time set up his camp right in front of the city. The people of the nearby Pisidian city of Termessos were their fierce enemies. They sent word to Alexander, offering their friendship and help. Alexander, thinking that it would take a long time to besiege and capture Termessos in this extremely rugged and geographically harsh region, marched on Sagalassos without wasting time. From Alexander's point of view, this is a passive defeat. The event at Termessos is so interesting that the city could only be taken after Alexander's death by his commander Ptolemy. The people of Sagalassos in the Taurus Mountains were also mountain-spirited, of strong character, healthy, wild, freedom-loving, and warlike. The walls of the city were like them, magnificent and solid. Alexander first attacked the Pisidians, who had taken up a battle formation on the top of the mountain. After chasing away the people here, he descended and occupied the city without any problems. He reached Seleunae, the satrapal center of the Persians, via Lake Burdur, famous for its salt. The people of the city surrendered without a fight. Meanwhile, the soldiers who had previously married locals and returned to Macedonia had formed new and fresh units of 3,500 men and had decided to meet Alexander the Great at Gordion. The winter of 334 to 333 before Christ was spent in the interior of Anatolia. It is not known where the accommodations were. Alexander now marched on Gordion, the legendary capital of the Phrygians, near Polatli. Kings always secretly envy and admire each other. They strive to achieve greater things and become even more famous. It can be said that this situation has been a factor in the growth of empires and in much more bloodshed. Alexander's intention was to capture the Acropolis, where the palace of the Phrygian king Gordius and his son Midas was located, to look at the mysterious Gordian knot, which was said to be there, tied to a chariot, and which in modern times the people have dubbed the impossible knot, and to try to solve it. He had plenty of reasons to solve the legendary Gordian knot, because legend foretold that the king who solved this knot would rule all of Asia. There was a peasant named Gordius who lived in Gordion. He was a poor peasant and had no property other than a pair of oxen and a small field. He would yoke one of the oxen to the plow and cultivate his tiny piece of land, and the other he would yoke to his cart. Once while plowing, an eagle flew and landed right on the yoke, and it stayed there until Gordius untied the strap of the yoke. The man was amazed. He set out to ask the soothsayers what it meant. On the way, he met a girl carrying water. He told the girl about the incident he had experienced. The girl was a prophetess and told the man to immediately return and make a sacrifice to King Zeus. Gordius told the girl to come with him and help him while offering the sacrifice. The girl accepted this. After the sacrifice was over, he married the girl. It was from this marriage that Midas, with his donkey ears and heart full of greed for gold, was born. Midas had grown up and reached the age of manhood. At that time, the Phrygians were engaged in a civil war that was eating away at society from within. The prophecy foretold that a day would come when a war chariot would bring them a king who would stop the war and re-establish peace. Just then, Midas, arriving with his family, drove his chariot into the midst of the assembled people.
The Gordians ruled that he was the person indicated by the prophecy and made him their king. Midas, who stopped the civil war, took his father's mysterious chariot to the Acropolis as a sacred relic and dedicated it to Zeus. The knot was made of a strong rope woven from dogwood bark fiber, and it was intricate and complex, so much so that neither of its two ends was visible. Alexander sat down at the knot and tried to solve it, but he could not. Finally, with his practical intelligence, thinking that how it was solved would not be a problem, he drew his sword and cut the rope. That night, the flashing lightning and falling stars indicated that the miracle had come true.
Alexander moved from Gordian to Ancyra, which is modern-day Ankara. In this insignificant and small Phrygian city, he met with Paphlagonian delegates who informed him that they would surrender. From there, Alexander, who passed into Cappadocia, took possession of the Cappadocian lands on both sides of the Kuzilmark River. This was quite easy, because the last satrap of the Persians, Mithridates, had been killed in the Battle of the Granicus. Sabictas was appointed as the new satrap of Cappadocia. After a journey through Anatolia full of long marches, battles, and sieges, he reached the Cilician gates, which would take him down to Cilicia. This was a narrow pass where at that time 2 people could barely walk side by side. Persian soldiers were lying in ambush in the pass, which a few squads of soldiers could easily defend. But Alexander managed to pass through easily, because the Persians, seeing the fearless king marching at the very front of his soldiers without any hesitation or fear, chose to flee. Thus he entered Cilicia in the autumn of 333 before Christ. His first act here was to liberate Tarsus, the largest and most civilized city of the region at that time, from the Persians, with a sudden maneuver. At that time, Tarsus was in the hands of hard-working and conscious people. The famous Lake Regma connected the city to the Mediterranean and made it an important port city. Although the season was autumn, the hellish heat had not yet ended. Indeed, one of his biographers, Quintus Rufus, when he says, "The oppressive heat of summer is nowhere as scorching as on the Cilician coasts," seems to share the suffering of the people living here. It's easy to say. For 2 years since he set out from his homeland of Pella, he had traveled over 2,000 kilometers, and not on a straight road. He passed through mountains, seas, rivers, and enemy-filled roads, fighting, without tasting comfort and luxury. Moreover, the region's geography, food, people, plants, wild animals, mosquitoes, and especially its climate were also completely foreign. All the responsibilities were on his shoulders. All the orders came from his mouth. He was physically and mentally very tired and exhausted. He had set up camp with his soldiers, who were at least as tired and exhausted as he was, on the bank of the Tarsus River. The cool water of the river and the gushing waterfalls were inviting him to swim. The rivers in Silifka were like emeralds and invited everyone to drink me, swim in me. While everyone was busy with camp preparations, he quickly undressed in front of the admiring eyes of his soldiers and threw his athletic body, covered in sweat and carrying layers of dust from his long journey through Anatolia, into the ice-cold waters of the healing river, which even ancient sources praised as clear, refreshing, and clean. Unexpected and strange things happened. He couldn't swim. He was faltering. It wasn't a danger of drowning. The cold water he suddenly dived into had stiffened his sweaty and hot body. His complexion suddenly turned pale, and he had fits of shivering. His body, about to lose all signs of life, was pulled out of the water by his soldiers and servants and placed in his tent on the riverbank. In an instant, clouds of sadness and gloom had already descended, and the fear of the king's possible death had gripped everyone.
What frightened and terrified his soldiers, unit commanders, and friends the most was the thought that such a great man in history would not die at the hands of the enemy in battle, but would perish here, in the waters of an ordinary river, while innocently washing himself.
Who knows how happy Darius would be about this? Who would lead them from now on? Who would rain down on them the orders that led to the truest paths, to salvation, to victory? Who would take them from this swampy land, full of enemies on all sides, and lead them to safe places? Who would lead the way and lead them back through that narrow and dark pass in front of the eyes of a world paralyzed with astonishment and fear? But the worst of all was the possibility that their young king, who was always with them, the same age as them, their brothers, would bid farewell and depart without having tasted the battles and victories that awaited him, without realizing the plans in his mind, which was brimming with genius and innovation, and this possibility was destroying them. They walked on tiptoe around the tent, on the dust-covered grass scorched by the summer heat, murmuring in half Greek, half Macedonian, and praying to Zeus. Among them were those who were older than him, and they were trying hard not to cry, to avoid that cursed act that was unbecoming of heroism, manliness, and soldiery. But among them was one who looked nothing like a soldier, with a wise face, deep in thought, walking as if sleepwalking, who kept going in and out of the tent, constantly carrying something in his hands. This man was the king's loyal friend and personal physician, Philip. What else could he be holding in his hands but the medicines he hoped would bring his king back to life? On the other hand, everyone, starting with Zeus, was praying to their own gods. Libations were even poured into the river that had made Alexander so ill. Thank goodness a miracle happened. The patient, who was lying there as if lifeless, began to show some signs of life. Yes, he could move his eyes, and although weak and faltering, he could breathe. His friends and comrades, who were very happy that he had recovered a little, had to throw him into the arms of despair with some bad news. As soon as he woke up, he would fall not into exhaustion, but into anxiety and depression, because they had received news that the Persian Emperor Darius would descend on Cilicia within 5 days, and they had to inform their leader of this without wasting time. Alexander, who was very upset by this and was worried that he would lose his chance to achieve victory, looked around in a bewildered and weak state and told those around him that it was no longer possible for him to stay in bed for a long time and wait in vain for the effects of the medicines, and that the smartest and manliest course of action was to get up immediately. He also added that it was better to die heroically by his own will than to recover slowly by lying in bed for a long time. It is said that after he recovered, he lamented, "I am a poor wretch. Why didn't I learn to swim?" In such situations, men think that lying in bed is something for women whom they view with a weak eye. And who knows, maybe that was what was on Alexander's mind at that moment. So what were they going to do? Those around him were very skeptical about the medicines to be given to the king for his treatment, because besides their effects, it was feared that he could also fall victim to an assassination. And they were right about this. The area was full of Persian agents, and Darius had announced that he would give a full 1,000 talents of gold to whoever killed Alexander. A letter of denunciation from Parmenion was handed to Alexander the Great. It stated that the Persians would poison him, that they had even bought his doctor Philip for this purpose, and that in return for doing this he would be given generous amounts of gold and even the king's sister. It was unbelievable.
If his most trusted person did this, who could he trust any more? After reading this letter, which filled his heart with deep sorrow and greatly confused his mind, he rolled it up and hid it under his pillow. At the appointed day and time, Philip entered the tent with his medicines in hand. Alexander's trust in him was so great that while on one hand he was taking the letter out from under his pillow with his left hand, on the other he said, "It is better to be betrayed and die than to be a victim of my cowardice," and stretched out his right hand, took the medicine in the cup, and drank it without hesitation.
Only after that did he take the letter from under his pillow and hand it to Philip. He had fixed his eyes on his doctor's eyes to see if he could see any signs of remorse or betrayal on his face. But of course all suspicions were baseless, and not only did he not see any such sign, but he saw that his loyal doctor was very upset by the fabrications and lies he read in the letter, and was grieving inwardly. Now a role reversal had almost taken place, and the patient was consoling and comforting his doctor. In the final act of this dramatic story, Alexander extended his right hand to the grateful Philip. He wanted to feel his love and compassion in his veins. The medicine was so strong and effective that for a moment his breath seemed to stop. Upon this, old suspicions began to spread again, and those who said that the letter of denunciation was true emerged. But Philip did not leave his patient's side for a second. He wiped his constantly sweating face with wet cloths. He continued the treatment, ignoring what was happening. He had a value in his hand that was more effective than medicines: his confidence in his professional knowledge, his warm love, and his compassion. The doctor was now reviving his unconscious patient Alexander with the smells of food and by making him drink wine, and he was trying to keep him awake, alert, and alive by constantly reminding him of his mother, his sisters, and the glorious victories that awaited him. Yes, as a result of this patient and dramatic treatment, the medicines had thoroughly penetrated the patient's veins, and he had returned to life. After lying in bed for 3 more days, he found the strength to face his soldiers. When he stepped out of his tent, the soldiers wanted to see Philip as much as they wanted to see him, and they were constantly cheering. The soldiers were now expressing their gratitude to this loyal doctor who came out of the tent in a bewildered state for that great man by holding his right hand, which came from his heart, as was their custom. As soon as Alexander recovered, he left Tarsus and occupied the large area between the Cilician gates and the Amanus Pass, which connected Cilicia with Mesopotamia in the east. He tasked Parmenion with holding the Amanus passes on the Syrian side and observing what was happening. His main enemy, Darius, was positioned just behind the same mountains. Alexander himself headed west to take precautions against possible dangers from the west, from the direction of Rough Cilicia. The famous warrior tribes of Isauria, a pirate haven that would later give the Romans a hard time and was famous for its rugged terrain and wildness, Larende and Iconium, that is, Karaman and Konya, could form an alliance and attack him from behind. He absolutely had to prevent this. He marched on Anchialus, near Mersin Karaduvar. According to legend, near this great city there was a huge statue of the Assyrian king Sardanapalus. He was depicted in a clapping and applauding posture, and there was an inscription in Assyrian on it that said, "O stranger, eat and drink and be filled with joy, for other human things are not worth striving for." Alexander later attacked the city of Pompiopolis, whose inhabitants were preparing to conspire against him from behind by collaborating with the Persians.
This place is located in Viranşehir, within the city of Mersin today. The inhabitants of this city traced their origins back to Phoenicia, and there was nothing that bound them to the Hellenes and Alexander. Their speaking very broken Greek and stuffing a lot of unnecessary vowels into their jumbled words was due to this. The people of Solipompeopolis were severely punished. A garrison was stationed in the city, and the city's inhabitants were condemned to pay a compensation of 200 talents.
Alexander, moving west from Soli, subjugated the mountainous parts of Cilicia over 7 days, sometimes through warlike and sometimes peaceful means, thus establishing communication routes with the regions in the west that he had previously occupied. It is not known how far west he went in western Cilicia, where there were still very few ancient cities at that time, and whether he reached the Guksu Delta. When he returned to Solipompeopolis, he received the news that Halicarnassus, which had resisted him relentlessly, had been occupied, and he was very happy about this. He combined this joy with his successes in Cilicia and his recovery from the illness he caught in Tarsus, and organized great feasts and festivities. He offered sacrifices to the gods. A formal parade with torches was held for the soldiers. Athletic games were organized. These festivities were so full and colorful that there is no doubt that they were of higher quality and more entertaining than today's holidays and neighborhood weddings. After this, Alexander returned to Tarsus. He sent a cavalry unit under the command of Philotas to occupy the plains beyond the Pyramus River. His main goal was to head east. He followed the coastline to Megarsis, that is, Karatash, and offered a sacrifice to the city goddess Athena. From there he went to Malus, whose exact location is still debated, but generally sought in Kizultakhta, and offered a sacrifice to the local hero Amphilochus. The places and roads he passed through here are controversial. The people of Malus, hearing of his arrival, were encouraged and had rebelled against Persian rule. Their freedom was restored as a reward for their loyalty. While Alexander was in Malus, he was surprised to receive the news that Darius had crossed the Euphrates River and had set up camp in the area just behind the Amanus Mountains on the present-day Turkish-Syrian border. He marched along the Ceyhan River to the east in the direction of Toprak Kala. He passed through the pass, which is 250 meters wide and where even today the land and railway lines pass below Toprak Kala, and came to the port city of Miriandrus, near the later-to-be-founded Iskenderun. This route was very well known from Xenophon, who had passed through these parts with his mercenaries about 74 years before him. Alexander was in a hurry. He had to cross the Belin Pass as soon as possible, and not give Darius the opportunity to cross the Amanus Mountains. But the season had progressed quite a bit. Especially the November rains, which fell heavily on the slopes of the Amanus, prevented him from crossing the mountains and valleys. In addition, the topographical structure of the region, which was quite well known to the Greeks, was about to play a unique trick on him. As if this were not enough, the intelligence failures that prevailed on both sides had caused chaos. The fugitive Cilician satrap Arsames had delivered incredibly false information to Darius, stating that Alexander was very close, even about to cross the Amanus. Darius, bewildered by this false news, sent his treasury and harem, which he carried with him along with his heavy equipment, to Damascus, and, with the intention of pursuing and chasing Alexander, whom he thought had fled, crossed the Amanus through the Bakche Pass, which was further north, and descended into the narrow plain at Issus, where the famous battle would take place. Alexander and his soldiers had already advanced south toward the Belin Pass. Thus, a battle was fought that was unprecedented in world history. The positions of the armies had changed, and what should have been in the north was in the south, and what should have been in the south was in the north. It was as if an invisible hand had placed the two armies on the two ends of a huge log and turned it 180 degrees. And this encounter had happened because the Cilician satrap Arsames had falsely informed Darius that Alexander had fled by crossing the Amanus.
We said Issus. However, despite all research, it is unfortunately still unknown where the battlefield, which should be sought near Issus, is located. We do not know the exact spot. Today, just west of Erzin, behind the railway and station building, there is a ruin sign that says Issus, but this is very misleading. In August 2009, I saw nothing there but aqueducts and a small mound. The yellow sign must have been put up by some officious person to attract tourists. Both kings had fought heroically, thousands of kilometers away from their main bases, Pella and Persepolis, almost in the middle of nowhere. Objectively speaking, it is certain that the Persians, who were on their own territory, had the advantage, not only because of their exaggeratedly large number of soldiers. Despite this, Alexander's superior success in this battle, where he achieved a decisive victory, cannot be denied. His self-confidence is clearly shown in the words attributed to him. "I am not afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion, but I am afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep." It was with this belief that he personally fought on the front lines. His fearlessness in the mosaics, when compared with the terror and fear read in the eyes of his enemy Darius, is better understood. Especially thanks to his crooked battle tactics, the Persian army was routed and Darius fled towards the direction he came from beyond the Amanus, leaving behind his possessions, most importantly his treasury and his family and harem, the symbol of his honor. After the Battle of Issus, just like all of Anatolia, Cilicia, and Syria also became part of Alexander the Great's world empire. From here, Alexander went south to Myrandris, which was intended to be settled by the Phoenicians near the not yet founded Iskanderun, then crossed the Amanus via Belen and pursued Darius, continuing his famous Asian campaigns. The real Asia begins when one crosses the Euphrates, and in Africa, which resembles it, when one descends into the Nile Valley. Not only in terms of its geographical structure, but both worlds are different from Europe in terms of human, spiritual, and cultural aspects. Asia is full of desolation, mysticism, and melancholy, and it is this unique factor that truly changed Alexander's mood and his outlook on the world. After the victory at Issus, he crossed the Amanus and marched on the Phoenician coasts. While all the cities surrendered, only Tyre resisted. To occupy the city, the island had to be connected to the mainland. In November of 332 before Christ, he entered the legendary lands of Egypt. He was welcomed as a liberator by the people who saw his many achievements as a miracle, and he wore the crown of the pharaoh in Memphis. He began to see himself as the son of Zeus. When the news that he had met with this god in the temple of Ammon was added to this, he fell into the delusion of deification. The mysterious air of the East had also captivated him, and he was actually slowly on his way to becoming a despot of the East that he hated. In the spring of 331 before Christ, the king returned to the city of Tyre. He defeated Darius again at the Battle of Gaugamela. He pursued the defeated and fleeing king and captured Babylon. He crossed the Zagros and entered the Persian lands. He reached Susa. He burned Persepolis as revenge. The year 330 before Christ took him to the lands of the Medes. He took Hamadan. Here he discharged his Greek soldiers. The historic mission of revenge that the Greeks had entrusted to him had been completed with a success that exceeded all expectations. But the king did not stop. He soon set out on the road again to penetrate the interior of Asia. He advanced along the Caspian Sea. He reached Afghanistan. In the meantime, he had one of his most loyal commanders, Parmenion, executed on charges of conspiracy, and formed a new army in place of the Greek soldiers he had discharged. In the winter of 330 to 329 before Christ, he advanced north along the Helmand River. He crossed the Bactrian and Hindu Kush mountains and suppressed the rebellions that broke out. Until the year 328 before Christ, he was busy suppressing other rebellions, especially those of the Scythians.
In all periods of history, the Persian Empire has been the strongest, best institutionalized state power in the Near East. The blow that Alexander struck under the guise of revenge was not very effective and lasting, and the Persian power, also known as the Sassanids, quickly recovered and stood against Alexander's successors, the Diadochi, and most importantly against the Roman, Byzantine, Mongol, Arab, and Turkish invasions. If the Arab invasion, which began in 633 after Christ and was completed in a short time, had not invaded and Islamized Iran, the military and cultural geography of the Near East would certainly have been different. As we said, Alexander had in time become one of the Eastern despots he disliked. He dressed like the Persian kings and behaved just like them. He even began to believe he was a god. But this was not accepted by the Macedonians and Greeks. Alexander's relationships with women and his marriages are among his lesser-known peculiarities. Like every soldier, his life, spent in barracks, on campaigns, and in battles, meant that he had little time for women. The words, "No one can accuse me of having cast an eye on Darius's wife. On the contrary, I have not even bothered to listen to those who describe her beauty," express his interest, or rather his indifference, to women. Nevertheless, in the course of time, he married a woman named Roxana, a Bactrian princess in the lands of Afghanistan. Roxana was the daughter of the Persian satrap of the region, Oxyartes. She would give birth to a son whom she named Alexandros Agos, but after her husband's early death, she would become a pawn in the wars between the Diadochi and would be executed along with her son on the orders of Cassander. Alexander saw no harm in polygamy. At a mass wedding held in Susa, besides Roxana, he also married two other ladies, Statira, who was likely Darius's eldest daughter, and Parysatis, the daughter of Artaxerxes III. Both women had accompanied Darius on his campaigns and had been taken captive by the Macedonians after the Battle of Issus. Statira was murdered as a result of an intrigue orchestrated by Roxana after Alexander's death. Alexander invaded India in 327 before Christ. In 325 before Christ, he arrived at the city of Patala in the Indus Delta. He began preparations for his return in the port and shipyard he had built there. He returned to Susa in 324 before Christ. From there he went to Babylon. This city would be the place where he closed his eyes for the last time. 10 days after a long and cheerful drinking party, on June 11, 323 before Christ, he passed away at the young age of 32. His body was taken to Memphis, and from there to Alexandria, and was buried in a golden coffin. Since Alexander's tomb has not been found, who knows, maybe he left it as his will, that a narrow grave would suffice for someone for whom the world was too small while he was alive. We do not know. He lived a short but intense and meaningful life. His compressed life was long enough to fill centuries. It is here that the often misused phrase, "You do not fit into history," finds its true place. His empire was divided among his commanders. Of these, the Ptolemaic dynasty took over the rule of Egypt, and the Ptolemaic dynasty continued to rule until Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. In the West, the civilized world outside of Rome and Carthage fell into the hands of his commanders. Now 3 generals would take the place of that one man, and that too was half-hearted. And finally, the young Alexander the Great also died. Alexander the Great, one of the most brilliant rulers and commanders in history, who changed humanity forever, renewed the whole world, laid the foundation of modern Europe, and determined that line between Asia and Europe. Even his grave is unknown. Isn't the story of great men always extraordinary?